Today's episode of the Counselling Tutor Podcast is sponsored by Web Healer. You're a counsellor in private practice and you need a website, or you've got an existing website which you need help with. Web Healer are offering Counselling Tutor Podcast listeners, that's you, £100 off the cost of a website design and build. Now, Web Healer specialise in websites for counsellors and psychotherapists. It's what they do. And the Web Healer team provide a completely non-technical, done-for-you solution, leaving you to focus your time on your clients. Operating for 20 years, Web Healer are a trusted resource amongst counsellors when it comes to getting your practice online. So get the package details and claim your £100 off coupon for your new website by going to counsellingtutor.com/website. That's counsellingtutor.com/website.
Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for counsellors, psychotherapists, and counselling students. Here are your hosts, Rory Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hi, I'm Rory, and with me, as always, is Ken. How are you doing, Ken?
Exceptionally well, thanks for asking, Rory. Rory and I are delighted you've joined us for the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Episode 275, and today we have 3 stops on our journey, starting off at Student Services, where we recognise the journey of becoming a counsellor, the study journey, and today we're going to be speaking about why ethics matter in counselling. And then we're going to be diving into ethical sustainable practice, where we kind of shout out to those that are either starting, running or scaling a private practice as a counsellor. We recognise that many of the skills we need to do that are not taught in our core training. And today we're going to be looking at getting your tax affairs in order. And then we go into Practice Matters, which is the CPD portion of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Make sure you claim those CPD points. And today we're speaking to Chrissie Henson. And the topic today is around her new book, which is aimed at clients who wish to get a sense of what happens in therapy. But starting us off, Rory, those student services and why ethics matter in counselling.
Yes, I think it's an interesting one, isn't it? I remember I never really come across the term ethics until I started studying. And I naively thought that, counselling, when I started, you just sitting in front of people, listening to their issues and trying to help them. And of course, it's one of those professional points that one has to learn as a therapist to understand what is ethical, what is right, and what is wrong. That's basically the basis of ethics. And they matter because we have to work to an ethical framework. If you're a student and you're in practice, you may very well join one of the many professional bodies that are around as the NCPS, as a BACP. If you're a psychotherapist, you may either join the UKCP. One thing they'll have in common is that they all have a code of ethics, or sometimes referred to as a code of practice. And they matter because they give us a commonality. They give us a commonality way of working. And also it's a framework that clients can understand. Clients can understand if they formulate a complaint. And it's also a framework that we're taught, so we know that we don't overstep the mark. We know how to stay within a boundary and to make sure we're offering the very best service that we possibly can. And crucially, the ethical framework is the document that professional bodies will refer to should a complaint be raised, and they will look at if your behaviour has breached the ethical codes that you've signed up to and they provide.
Like that, Rory. And of course, those ethical frameworks, we have access to them as counsellors and psychotherapists, but so do clients. They're outward facing. So if you go to an ethical body website, you'll find that the code of ethics is freely available to anybody who wishes to download that. And it's actually good practice to point your client to the ethical framework to which you work, because it is there to protect both of you. And I guess you mentioned, Rory, coming into your counselling training and not even really understanding what ethics are and having an ethical framework means. And I guess the big question here is why? What is the reason for having an ethical framework? Why does it exist in the first place? And we look to a great handout, which I'll direct you to in a moment, where we cover it offers reassurance and protection to the general public through counsellors working to an agreed professional standard. And this is important, that can be measured. So this is not somebody suggesting what they feel is ethical from their frame of reference. It is in a general agreement. And when an ethical framework is put together, there is a process of going out to the members and asking them for their input and their feedback. And an expert reference group is put together to guide the development of that framework. It also ensures that the counsellor knows what conduct is right and wrong, and what they should do if they run into an ethical dilemma, or if they run into a situation where they go, what do I do here? Well, you can go to the framework and it's kind of there for you in black and white, and it kind of suggests how we might act in a certain situation. And of course, it provides a benchmark, Rory, for professional bodies against which complaints, as you've mentioned, and concerns can be elevated and practitioners held to account. You know, we're protecting those clients, and we're protecting the good name of counselling and psychotherapy, and the framework is part of that protection for us as counsellors, but also for our clients, Rory.
Yes, absolutely. The underpinning of a lot of therapy is something called utilitarianism. Easy for me to say. And it's a philosophy that basically boils down to the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. So most ethical frameworks talk about a commonality. It's the agreed commonality of what fits in our society and how we act in the benefit of the majority of people. And that means that we don't become tribal. It means that when we look to an ethical framework, we agree to work to a set of principles that are universal. They're universal within within our profession. And also within ethics, there's the ethics of fairness, sometimes they call Kantian ethics. And I won't go too much into Kantian ethics, so it could be a very, very long podcast. However, the idea that we are fair and just and effectively kind, and it's really, really important, because if we don't have an ethical framework, then what happens is therapists will make up their own boundaries and their own ideas and their own ways of working when it comes to clients. And those could be very different from therapist to therapist. I guess the equivalent is having a speed limit. You know, we have a national speed limit here in the UK on the motorway, which is 70 miles an hour. And it doesn't matter if you're driving in Cornwall or you're driving in Edinburgh or you're driving in Manchester. If you're on the motorway, you drive at 70 miles an hour. And if you go any faster than 70 miles an hour, you may very, very well find yourself in some difficulty should you be pulled over by the police. And an ethical framework is effectively gives us the framework that we can practice in. And I always tell this story when I talk about frameworks. When I was young, we used to have something in our local park called the monkey bars. And it was a square cage made up of scaffolding poles with lots of squares inside made of scaffolding poles. And the kids used to play inside it. And here's the thing, if you're inside that framework and you slip from the top, you just hit the next pole at the bottom and you never fall onto the ground. However, if you're on the outside of the framework and you fall from the top, you're going to get a mighty bumped head because there's nothing to hold on to. So it's really, really important. And it becomes a part of our conversation in therapy. So there's hardly a conversation I have with colleagues where the word ethics or ethical imperatives or how we're working ethically doesn't come up. It forms part of our common language.
And I guess that continues throughout the arc of being a counselor or a psychotherapist. So you're going to start off in your studies learning about the ethical frameworks, maybe comparing and contrasting to understand the difference between different types of ethical frameworks. But the ethical framework goes with you into practice. And when you are there in the room with your client, your ethical framework is almost there with you invisibly within the room. When you go into supervision, your supervisor is most certainly going to be looking to the ethical framework with the way that you are practicing to ensure that you are kind of working within that framework and within that safety that you've beautifully outlined there, Rory. And I like how you use the speed limit, because the speed limit is kind of commonly understood. We all kind of know what it is and what we should be doing. And the framework is the same. And even with some speed limits, you might think, I could go faster in this area here, why is it so slow? But we would still obey what the sign is saying. And that's the point with the ethical framework. Even if it is outside our frame of reference or our cultural beliefs or the way we would do it, it's a standard that we can look to and follow and know that we are working to best practice. So there's kind of an overview of ethical frameworks. But what kind of stuff are we going to be looking at? What's covered in an ethical framework? So some of the examples that we have in the handout that Rory's created, and I'll tell you where to get that in a moment, are things like use of titles. What do you call yourself? What are the initials that you put after your name? You can't just make things up. If you are accredited, you're going to maybe have different initials after your name to if you've just graduated and starting out as a counsellor. So those use of titles are kind of governed within that ethical framework. We might look to the ethical framework when it comes to advertising. How do we advertise our service? How do we find our clients? What is ethical advertising and what is not ethical advertising? Definitely would look to the framework when contracting. And this depends where you are in the world. So different countries will have different legislation governing where confidentiality can or cannot be broken. And of course, you would look to your ethical framework for that. Appropriate relationships with clients. Your client is your client. So dual roles, for example, is it a friend? Is it somebody you used to go to school with? Is that appropriate? Well, we would look to the ethical framework. Is it appropriate to have a romantic relationship with a client? Well, no. And we would look to the ethical framework, which would very strongly suggest no. Working with minors, vulnerable adults, that would be covered within the ethical framework, as would record keeping, when we should take our breaks, to avoid burnout of ourselves. That's protecting us. Working with a team would be covered. Your supervision, what you might take to supervision, training and education that you might do. If you're doing a research project, the first place you would look is that ethical framework. And of course, the most important thing, well, not most important, I guess it's all important, but it's something that we say often, Rory, and that is your continuing professional development. There is a requirement within your ethical framework that post-graduation, you continue to study, you continue to learn and update your knowledge. So there's just a few of the topics that might be covered in that ethical framework.
Yes, and some of you might be listening and thinking, well, who writes this ethical framework? Is it just some unelected body that sits in a dark room and preaches the morals of our profession? Well, the answer is no. The people who write the ethical framework is actually society in general. And through my 20 years of practice, the ethical framework has changed a number of times to reflect the mores of society. So when I first started 20 years ago, there was no comment on gay conversion therapy. If people wanted to practice gay conversion therapy, which is, I will say personally, abhorrent, you could do it. And then a few years ago, the ethical body I was with at the time wrote a memorandum as an addition to the ethical framework and said that they now consider that is unethical to practice gay conversion therapy. And that is, that forms part of the code of ethics. So the code of ethics is a living thing, and it's developed on how society is. So, as we move on, we will see more changes in ethical frameworks. And one of the big changes we'll see, I suspect, in the ethical framework is the use of AI, quite possibly, because that is going to impact our society greatly. And ethical bodies do ask for feedback. They go to their membership and they say, we're changing or we're reviewing the ethical framework. And if you're a member, you have a voice and you can input that. And they have a look at it, and then they adapt the framework for where society is at the time the ethical framework's published. So it's a living document. It's not kind of pittled in aspic like a pittle. It's living. It's a living document, and it's fascinating. And I've seen, the code of ethics, a number of code of ethics change, develop, become more nuanced through the years. And I think it's fair to say this podcast recorded in the September of 2023. I think by 2024, middle of 2024, we may have from the varying professional bodies an updated code of ethics, because I think most code of ethics are due for a bit of a refresh. But it becomes a integral part of your practice. Listen to any therapist having a conversation about their practice. Won't be long before ethical framework comes up, and it forms a rich part of our work and our thoughtfulness when we engage with clients.
Yeah, and as we kind of back out of this topic, Rory, I just wanted to mention you have your main ethical framework, but what we're seeing on more and more is small kind of subsections that give us ethical guidelines on specialist areas of working. So children and young people, there would be guidelines on working with children and young people, working online or via telephone, so working remotely. There would be separate guidelines around that. And I think it kind of keys into what you were saying, Rory, that kind of as time goes on and as the world changes, so all of these new guidelines come into effect and perhaps eventually would make their way into the main framework. I would not be surprised with a rewrite of any of the main ethical frameworks if we wouldn't see a higher presence of online telephone and remote working, because it is now a reality, and a lot of practitioners are working this way. And of course, we need those guidelines to show us what is that best practice to protect us, to protect our clients at the end of the day. But there's a super duper handout. Rory has made it for you, and you can get that by going to counsellingtutor.com. That's our mother website. Click on the podcast tab, go to episode 275. That's today's episode 275. Right there on that page, you will find the handout. It's called Top 5 Tips for Writing an Assignment on Ethics in Counselling. This is a really good handout to go grab, have it on hand for when ethics are discussed either in your training or if you have to write an assignment about it. Student Services is sponsored by Counselling Skills Academy. Have you ever wondered if you're using counselling skills effectively? Confidentiality means we rarely see skills used by others, so it's no wonder that so many students say they lack confidence in their counselling skills. That's why I built Counselling Skills Academy. Counselling Skills Academy is an online course that you can do at your own pace. It will give you the skills competence and confidence to know that you're using your skills most effectively. You will see real counselling skills used by a counsellor in real life sessions, covering everything from how risk is assessed right through to working towards an appropriate ending. Visit counsellingskillsacademy.com to learn more and to claim your counselling tutor discount. That's counsellingskillsacademy.com. So there it is. That is Student Services, and moving away from Student Services into our ethical, sustainable practice, where we recognize those that go into private practice. There are many skills that we have to learn and many things we have to take into consideration, not just working with the clients, things that maybe weren't covered in our core training. And one of the questions we see often asked is how somebody should set their company up, whether they should do it as a sole trader or a limited company, because it all comes down to having tax implications at the end of the day. What is it? The certainties of life, death and taxes. I think it was very wisely said. We're going to pay those taxes, but getting your tax affairs in order is important. You don't want to be caught by surprise, Rory.
No, and I think this is something that affects a lot of people who start off in in business. They start off in business and they put their focus into, quite clearly the business related things, such as their advertising or their meeting clients and doing CPD and doing all those things. And in the background is a ticking clock, and that ticking clock is a clock that says you have to pay your taxes, and you have to pay them by a certain time. And I think sometimes it's one of those things that when you start off as a small business can be a bit confusing. So what we've done is, if you go to counsellingtutor.com and if you go to podcast episode 275, in the show notes, there's some handy links to British government websites, which will tell you a lot about setting up a business, setting up your tax affairs. And, Ken and myself aren't tax advisors. We're just a couple of peers talking about the world of counselling practice. So obviously seek some professional advice. But you do have to think about, on a very basic level, realising that for every pound the client gives you, part of that pound or whatever currency that you have in the country you're in goes to the tax people. And it's good discipline, I think, on a very basic level, maybe to open a second bank account up and to put that tax money into the bank account and consider that not your money, but the tax money. And that way you separate what's your money and what actually is going to be collected by the tax. I have two bank accounts. I have a bank account for my normal finances, and I have a tax bank account because I'm a self-employed person. And when I pay myself, or when I get paid, I put a certain amount, percentage of that into the tax account. So I don't have to worry when I put my tax returns in and I get a large bill or a bill from the Inland Revenue. I just pay it. It's not my money. It belongs to the government. That's my attitude.
Yeah, it reminds me of the faraway elephant scenario. So it can be tempting to kind of look at tax as something that's going to happen one day far down the line. And if you think about a faraway elephant, it looks really small. It's really far away from you. But if it's constantly moving towards you at a steady rate, it doesn't take too long before it becomes very big and quite overwhelming. And that is a trap that is easy to fall into when starting a business, specifically if you're coming from employment where you're used to getting a salary and the tax is already deducted. But checking out what it is that you need to pay. If somebody is giving you cash in hand or making a deposit into your bank account per session, how much of that needs to go aside? And it's not just tax. There are different kinds of taxes within the tax. And I'm speaking in the United Kingdom now. And as Rory has already said, our disclaimer is we are not advising on tax. It's two peers having a discussion. Get professional advice. However, here in the United Kingdom, we have national insurance, which is also a kind of tax. So you might put your tax aside, but there is also an additional payment that needs to be paid over. Also, if you kind of hit a certain threshold, you may need to pay VAT or GST if you're in a different country, general sales tax or value added tax here in the United Kingdom, and it's in another form of tax. So it's about understanding what tax you are liable for, and it will generally work around how much your projected income is, and speak to a professional of how you can divvy that up. And Rory's advice and guidance works really well. I use it too. I use separate bank accounts, and I just put when money comes in, I'll say that much is mine, the rest is not. And I divide it up quickly because I have a terrible temptation to spend it, Rory. If it's just sitting in one account, I lose track. I can't remember where it all came from. So to avoid that, having separate bank accounts is really useful. And your taxation will also kind of line up to how you've set up your business. So if you've gone in as a sole trader, it's me, myself, I'm in practice and I'm going to register as a sole trader. Well, then all of the income that comes in is seen to belong to you as an individual person. If you register as a limited company, there are expenses tied to that I have to add in. Then the money that comes in is not seen as your money. It is seen to be going into a separate entity. The limited company owns the money, and you can draw a salary or you can draw money in various ways from that limited company, and the taxation varies and is different. And it depends on what your projected income might be from that would kind of denote what would be the best option for you, whether to go sole trader or limited company. And of course, those names vary depending on where you may be in the world. And I think the best advice, not that I'm giving any advice, would be to speak to an accountant on that. They are well versed in taxation and the law, and so many accountants will do a 20 to 30 minute free introductory session where you can ask a load of questions and get some guidance and advice. And who knows, you may then employ their service to do your end of year books or something like that, Rory.
Yeah, absolutely. And in my experience, and again, this is just my experience, it might not be other people's experience, but actually the accountant's fees are usually covered by the amount of money they'll save you, because that's their job. Their job is to tell you what you can legally claim and put against your business. So if I go anywhere and I have a train ticket maybe, to do some CPD, I could claim that train ticket against my business. I put that in. So that's important. And there's lots of things you can claim. You'd be surprised on how much you can reasonably claim if you're running a business, especially if you're running it from home. A lot of people in the online world now work from home solely. But if you work, face to face, you're renting a room, you can claim a portion of that rent back. There's so much you can claim, and I found that if you hire an accountant, a reasonable accountant, they usually pay for themselves. Because you can claim all sorts of things legally, which lowers your tax bill. So I think that's really important. And what I would say is, if you are, just starting out, maybe you're thinking, I'm doing my advertising, I'm reaching out, I'm doing my socials, all my social network. I would say, pop onto our website, go to episode 275, click those government links. There's a lot of free help there for you on the podcast page, and there's nothing worse. I've had friends who've, phoned me up with a very glum voice and said, "You never guess what? I've got a tax bill and I can't afford to pay it." And that's the worst place in the world to be.
and sadly, it's not that uncommon.
No.
That's the reality of that. It's easy to get caught. And again, we introduced this section into the Counselling Tutor Podcast, ethical, sustainable practice, because we're perhaps not taught how to manage tax when we're doing our formal counselling training. I don't remember a single moment of my counselling training dedicated to tax provision. And when it comes to you mentioned, Rory, the things that you can claim back on your tax. You'd be surprised some of the things that you can claim. You'd also be quite surprised at some of the things you cannot claim that you might think you can claim. Now, one of the dangers of claiming back tax on things that you can't really claim tax on is it can set off a flag and cause a closer look at your tax affairs, which you kind of want to avoid. But knowing what you can claim is really empowering, but it requires learning it, finding out. So, and it's a different mindset. You may be out at an in-person CPD event, you meet up with a peer over lunch, and together you go and sit down and have a coffee, and you go, you know what, I'll get this coffee, and you have a coffee together and you have a chat. Well, can you claim that on tax? And these are the questions you want to be asking yourselves all the time. Could you say that is a professional peer discussion? I was out of my office. I needed to have food and drink during my time. And of course, these are the questions that you would ask yourself. It's just a different mindset. And having a specialist on hand, an accountant, to advise you, really good practice, I think, Rory. And like you said, they should be saving you the money that you pay over to them in the services that they offer and what they save you. Go to episode 275, counsellingtutor.com. Those links are there for you. They are UK centric, I guess. So if you are elsewhere in the world, might go and have a look at them anyway, and then kind of look around within your area what is available. And that for today is our ethical, sustainable practice. And we move in now to Practice Matters, the CPD section of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. And Rory, you met up with Chrissie Henson, who has written a book. Now, I've gone and looked this book up on Amazon, and it only has 5-star reviews. And those that have read this book are raving about it. And it's interesting because it's slightly different, because often as counsellors, we read books related to counselling and training for counselling and delivering counselling. This is the opposite way around. This book is aimed at clients that wish to get a sense of what happens in therapy, Rory.
Absolutely. It's written by Chrissie Henson, and as we're here, is a inspirational therapist and very thoughtful to write a book that really is a gift. You know, if you've got a friend who's struggling, it's a wonderful gift to give someone who's thinking of going into therapy, because it gives them an overview of what might happen in therapy, and it can, for those people who've never been to therapy before, it could be very, very helpful to understand the processes of it. I caught up with Chrissie, and this is what she had to say about her book.
Practice Matters is proudly sponsored by the Counsellor CPD Library. To access top quality, relevant continuing professional development for your practice that you can do at a time that suits you, and all for less than the price of a cup of coffee, visit counsellingtutor.com.
Diversity in therapy is really, really important, which is why it's my great pleasure to speak with Chrissie Henson, an author, a therapist, and someone who's just published a book on inside the therapy room. And just as a form of introduction, Chrissie has cerebral palsy, which does affect her speech. So for those of you who'll be able to hear her, that's fine. And for those of you who may want a little help with that, we're going to pop a transcript into the web page on counsellingtutor.com. To get that transcript, go to counsellingtutor.com, go to the podcast tab, click podcast 275, and on the show notes page, you'll see the transcript, and you can listen and read along if you like. So first of all, Chrissie, thank you so much for joining us.
No, thank you. It's a pleasure to meet you in person after years of you helping me behind the scenes of all your work on your podcast and things.
Well, it's always a pleasure to interview a listener and a watcher of our work, and you're very welcome if it's helped you along your journey. That's brilliant, and I guess that brings me neatly to your book called A Look Inside the Therapy Room. It's available on Amazon now. You can download it on Kindle or buy a physical copy of the book, and this book really, I think, is not only a reflection of your practice, but also will be very helpful maybe in times of a cost of living crisis to clients who may be looking for help. So just tell me a little bit about who may read this book and what help it can give.
Okay, I'm kind of looking at this from two different groups of people. The first group of people I think it will really benefit are students and those trained to become therapists in counselling, psychotherapy, psychodynamic, because it, like you say, it gives a fly on the wall, look at what happens. And you might not have started your placements yet. You might just be in level 2, level 3 and think, what is it actually like to be in the room? And that's what my book gives at the beginning. It gives answers to the common questions that I've been asked by clients and potential clients for the last 7 years. The other group of people that I hope is going to help are those that are needing professional counselling or therapy. Not necessarily for everyone to come to me, but to get rid of the taboos and the fears of what the therapist is going to say, what they're going to do, what do I need to do. There's a lot of people that are worried that you're going to tell them what to do. You're going to know all the answers. They're going to be inferior. And I want to get rid of that feeling. When they come in the room, it's an equal partnership. We're going to work together to find answers that help them.
Yes, and I think that's a wonderful summary. The idea on at least one level is that clients or even students of counselling and psychotherapy, well, let's have a look at the client, a potential client, someone needs help, can buy this book, and it kind of demystifies what goes on really behind closed doors and in confidence. You know, what does happen when someone goes in a therapist room? So you're talking about that from your experience. You've been practicing for 7 years. And also there's a help there for student therapists who are maybe wondering, what real life experiences a therapist has, what kind of things goes on, how are certain issues dealt with. So really there's two, I guess, important groups, if you like, or cohorts that could really benefit from downloading your book or buying it, Chrissie.
Yeah, hopefully. I mean, I've already had some really brilliant feedback on the book, and I'm just trying to get it out to a bigger audience. Because I feel the chapters at the back of the book that they took about different areas. So that there's one about rejection, there's one about disability and therapy, men in therapy, young adults in therapy, because they're the areas that I work with a lot. But I also feel that when I've done my reading as both a student and my personal CPD going forward, they're also the areas that I feel are not being spoken about that much. Like, for example, the young adults. When I say young adults, I'm talking like people university age that are just leaving home for the first time with a to university or to work. And it's that shock of, oh my God, this isn't what I expected.
Yes, I mean, just looking at the contents, it seems like there's a lot of specific areas that you've taken the time to write about, and things like exploring death, disability in therapy, young adults in therapy, which kind of picks up on your point about, young people coming back from university and maybe, being away from home for the first time and struggling. One of the things that I thought was really interesting was rejection and therapy. That's not something that's often talked about, I don't think.
No, it isn't. I don't think I can ever remember reading about it in any of the books that I read. I've read from student age up till now. And I don't think rejection can happen in a number of ways. It can be rejection from a parent, rejection from a partner, or even being rejected from a job. I was personally made redundant before I started my training as a therapist. And I'm thinking I'd worked really hard for that company for 8 years, and then they just decide you no longer fit what we need. And it's kind of like that is a form of rejection. And it does impact you. For me personally, I've never come back and worked for another company since I've been self-employed, because I just feel like you can myself.
Yes, yeah, the impact on you being rejected from your job was so strong that you chose to be a self-employed person rather than take the risk of being rejected again.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something that isn't often discussed in therapy. And also men and therapy. I thought that was quite interesting because, again, not something that's talked about very much because in my experience, and my experience isn't the be all and end all by any stretch of the imagination, but my experience in talking to colleagues, men presenting therapy maybe quite differently from women.
Yeah, I mean, years gone by, men wouldn't even ask for help. I think we've come a very, very long way, which is really good to see. But I still think it's a lot harder for men to ask for help than a woman or somebody that doesn't identify as either. But particularly in that, the chapter that I've written in my book, it not only introduces men in therapy, it also some male rape. And that, again, is a subject that you don't hear about a lot, you don't read about a lot. And I just thought, again, it was important to acknowledge that it does happen.
Absolutely. And yes, it's something, it's one of those things. Certainly male rape is something that is something that obviously happens. It's obviously something that happens and probably happens more frequently than we would like to think, sadly. But it's not often discussed in terms of how you work with that therapeutically. So I think that's that sounds to me like a really interesting chapter, as is disability and therapy. I mean, obviously we're speaking to you today. We've talked about how your voice is affected by cerebral palsy. And I think that, again, it's something that isn't widely discussed or widely engaged with. I mean, we're hopefully having a respectful conversation about the challenges that you have. But I think that sometimes that's quite a difficult conversation for therapists to have, isn't it?
Yeah, it is particularly difficult for clients that are living with disabilities that are not always visible as well.
Yes.
For me particularly, I can't hide my disability. You hear it the minute I speak. When you see me, you see it by the way that I move. And there's kind of pros and cons to both sides, because the proof for that is everyone sees it so they can choose to adapt. But then those that don't want to adapt, I can't hide it. It's there. It's visible. But that's the same for people with non-visible disabilities. It's almost like they've got to tell everyone that what the situation is, because it's not plain to see. And then it's like it's not always believed because it's not visible.
Yes, and that can be quite traumatic in itself, having to repeat time and time again about what someone's disability is when it's not clear. And I guess the organisation or the situation that person find themselves in hasn't adapted itself to working with disabled people. Usually it comes up in my experience where there's a gap in support for a disabled person, be it use of stairs or use of toileting facilities, or I mean the list goes on, doesn't it, of what can be missing in a therapy room that would kind of prompt someone to say, well, I can't do that because I've got a disability. Even I guess the choice of seating, isn't it, as well?
Yeah, because you've got to be comfortable while they're speaking to you. And it's even like acknowledging that not everyone can sit down for 50 minutes either. I worked with a young lad that had autism. And again, visibly you wouldn't have known that. But the minute the session started, his anxiety would go up, and then he would find it really difficult to sit down. So we had to find ways around that. Absolutely.
And it's this, I guess, speaks to the part of the book that would be really useful for students, even qualified practitioners. You're sharing your experience and saying, look, have you thought of this? And one of the things that I'm really struck, I'm just kind of reading the book here online. You put in pause for thoughts. So they're like little kind of thinking and assessing full stops at the end of the chapter. And what I'm looking for, which is about, what is therapy? It starts off, pause for thought. Have you been in therapy before? What did you find helpful and what didn't work and why? And it is literally a pause for thought, isn't it? Helps people to, crystallise their thinking and, generally, gets them to prompt more questions.
Yeah, that the pause for thought is probably one of my favourite parts of the book, because I just feel like it involves the reader, doesn't it? So you've read the chapter and you might not relate to it, or you might feel you don't relate to it, and you get those questions at the end of it, and you kind of go, oh yeah, that could be me. I could think about it in that way. And I just like the idea of the reader feeling like it's for them. It's not just read about me, read about my clients. It's for them to look at their thoughts, their feelings, their emotions. And that's not just potential client. That could be, like you say, practicing therapists, trainee therapists. When they've read it, how do they relate to it? What do they think? What do they feel? How would they work with the clients I've spoken about?
Absolutely. And I think that having put in those punctuations is so useful. I'm looking at the book now. There's so much in it, and we could talk for so much longer about it. A Look Inside the Therapy Room by Chrissie Henson is available on Amazon. We will put a link to both the transcript and also the book in episode 275 of the Counselling Tutor podcast. If you go to Counselling Tutor, click the podcast tab, go to episode 275, you'll see it all there. And maybe something that may be helpful for you in your practice, or something you can give to someone who may be thinking about entering therapy. And we've heard you loud and clear today, Chrissie. I want to say that we've heard you loud and clear about what this book is about. So Chrissie Henson, thank you so much for joining us.
Massive thank you to Chrissie Henson. A big thank you to you, Rory. You're reaching out, finding the right people to bring us the interesting topics here on the Counselling Tutor podcast. You've been listening to episode 275.
Yes, and yes, it's been an interesting episode. And if you've enjoyed the episode, why don't you share us on your social media platforms? Give us a tweet, give us an Instagram, share us across. And also, if you're on iTunes platform, why don't you give us a 5-star review? And we started with student services, why ethics matter in counselling. We moved on to ethical, sustainable practice, talked about getting your tax affairs in order. And finally, the wonderful interview with Chrissie Henson talking about her new book, A Look Inside the Therapy Room. And as always, stay grounded and stay safe.
Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. Counselling Study Resource, or CSR for short, is the world's most comprehensive assignment guidance and study support resource for students just like you of counselling and psychotherapy. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode by visiting counsellingtutor.com.